Home gardening sits at a puzzling place in the world of hobbies and passions. On the one hand, it can be very casual and relaxing occupation with little to no real expectation for what you will get out of it. And on the other hand, it's something very concrete and real with fairly high stakes. Gardening connects us to the age-old activity of providing for our own personal needs by growing plants, which for much of our genetic history affected our very survival. It's no surprise that we're asking the question more and more of large-scale agricultural operations, is this sustainable? Because at a certain level, we know it has to be. Our survival depends on it being sustainable. But whereas recent history has led us to accept industrial-scale farming as the way that we'll feed ourselves, it is just that, recent history. And it's anybody's guess what the next few decades will look like when it comes to agriculture and the way that food is provided for people. However, as sustainability has increasingly entered the conversation, the fragility of our current systems have only been left more exposed. And this leads me to believe that we'll see a shift towards smaller, more localized farming operations, even sprouting up from people's own backyards. Which leads me to the question of this video: is home gardening sustainable? And even more specifically, is your garden sustainable? In this video, I'm going to take a look at that question of sustainability when it comes to our current practices, the accepted norms of home gardening. And I'm going to take it a step further and also ask the question, what does regenerative home gardening look like? As vague and broad as the terms sustainable and regenerative can be, something that they are both doing inadvertently is that they're bucking the norm. And the norm in this case is what we often call conventional. Conventional gardening practices often mirror a lot of conventional farming practices. So things like yearly tilling, chemical fertilizer applications, planting genetically modified plants that can survive glyphosate, which is, by the way, the #1 herbicide sold to farmers and home gardeners alike. You might have seen it as Roundup on store shelves. And then even just the basics of monocropping transfers to home gardeners. And this is elusive for many home gardeners because you might be thinking, well, I grow more than one type of plant in my garden. I even interplant basil with my tomato plants, and I put green onions in between my lettuces. All of that is great. But when you think about the effect that monocrop agriculture has on not just the soil life, but also the wildlife, the same effect is often achieved in our own backyards. And that's because annual vegetables and flowers, as great as they are, aren't always really providing too much for pollinators and natural predators in your growing space. Not all of your veggies are even going to make flowers by the time that you harvest. And beyond that, not all flowers even support pollinators, at least not to the extent that we really need to be supporting them. So when we look at conventional home gardens, we're looking at growing spaces that are made simply with the intention of supporting the gardener. Conventional farms grow plants and raise livestock in such a way that disregards natural processes at all costs for the sake of efficiency. Same with conventional home gardens. Now again, if you're just getting started, if this is your first year and you just want to try growing a few herbs and some salad mix, this might feel like a bit of a stretch to think about incorporating other non-food plants in your garden as well. The problem with only planting veggies, though, becomes apparent when those pollinator predator populations are non-existent, which leaves the last P, pests, unchecked. And when we cap things off there, the temptation to use harsh pesticides to defend your precious crops goes way up. What's challenging about this is that few gardeners who are just starting out are going to know much of this. They're just going to start planting tomatoes and wait for harvest without realizing that they just brought in a treasure trove of food for their local aphid population. Really, what would solve this problem is if new gardeners knew to start by investing in the environmental qualities of their growing space. That's not super likely to happen though, and that's okay, because as we dive into our sustainable and regenerative practices, they can all be retrofitted into your home garden with relative ease. As we get into these topics, I want to start by offering a brief explanation of each. Sustainable and regenerative go hand in hand and often overlap, but are very different at the core and have different end goals. And I don't know if there is any official definition for either of these topics, so I'm just going to create my own, but feel free to let me know in the comments if you have a different way of putting these. Sustainable practices in gardening refer to practices that can be replicated ongoing. They don't run out. They don't require a disproportionate input for what they're getting out of it. and they certainly don't come at the expense or the sacrifice of someone else's well-being. And I'll try to make this clear as we go. But it's worth me saying right now that I don't mean to make any of this a strictly moral thing. When we look at sustainability and regeneration, I personally do feel a substantial moral and ethical compulsion attached. But there's also, maybe above everything else, a highly practical rationale for pursuing better practices. A very simple example of unsustainability in home gardening is what we already mentioned: broad spectrum, harsh chemical pesticides. These come not only at the expense of the existing beneficial insect population, but they can also harm microbiology in the soil and leave plants' immune systems weakened. Another similar but more complex example of unsustainable practices is repeatedly using chemical fertilizers. And we'll return to this one in particular, as I've received many questions and a bit of pushback on this topic. If we can learn, though, how to create solutions for these problems on site or from within the garden itself, we're going to be well on our way to having a sustainable garden. But before we get into solutions, let's take a look at regenerative. Regenerative gardening is actually a bit easier for me to define. Leave it better than you found it. This applies to the soil, the biodiversity, the overall quality of the growing environment. Where it becomes cloudy are the mechanisms for accomplishing this. Joel Salatin is quite possibly one of the originators, or at least primary champions, of the term regenerative agriculture, and a lot of what he teaches has to do with regenerative livestock or holistic management. Permaculture is another form of what we call regenerative gardening, and here we find systems of design that lead to better and better growing environments rather than worse and worse conditions where many conventional approaches are used. Korean natural farming is also an excellent example of regenerative agriculture, in my opinion, especially with its focus on conditioning the microbial systems at work in your growing space. None of these frameworks are going to provide the full picture, but we can learn, adapt, and adopt these techniques for ourselves. And I like to say rules have to be adopted, but patterns can be adapted. So we're going to look at these arenas in terms of the available patterns. And we'll specifically look at fertility, soil treatment, and systems for sustainable regenerative gardening. By fertility, I'm referring to the whole way that we get our plants the nutrients and enzymes that they need to grow. By soil treatment, I'm talking about the way that we prepare the soil that our plants will inhabit. And by systems, I mean the tangible and intangible structure, the design of the growing space itself. Now, I said before that sustainable and regenerative are two terms that mean distinct things, but the mechanisms that we utilize can cross over. For example, growing a plant on site with which to make a liquid fertilizer that will be used to feed plants could be both a sustainable choice as well as lead to a regenerative effect. The one huge caveat that I want to make before we get into the sustainability conversation a bit more deeply is that we want to be working for progress over perfection. A lot of the time, we have these big ideas of complete overhauls that we're going to do. We want to start grazing our chickens rotationally around our backyard, and we're going to set up our bokashi system, and we're going to make all of the Korean natural farming inputs, and we're going to save all of our cardboard, and we're going to get wood chips delivered. But if you are going from a strictly conventional to a sustainable and regenerative approach, you're going to need to take some more time to really make that transition. Too sharp of a turn can break things or make them fizzle out. So as we look into these two frameworks, think about how you can take one step closer to them. And if this all feels a bit overwhelming and you'd like some help making the journey, you would probably really enjoy my gardening community on School. You can take pictures of your personal garden to share, ask questions, ask for advice, and even access tons of free resources to help you make progress toward your sustainable and regenerative garden. You can scan the code on the screen or hit the link in the description to get signed up completely for free. The other part of this is that in some cases, there are simply trade-offs that need to be made. And trade-offs mean that there are less than ideal things that we do in and for our garden for the sake of making other things better. One example of a trade-off that Cassidy and I are making is in our use of plastic landscape fabric. We've chosen to remove the burden of ongoing weeding, especially in these early seasons of growing, by covering our soil with permeable landscape fabric that will help stifle weed growth. Now, plastic is one of the least sustainable options of materials, and we're striving to use less and less of it in our personal lives, but it simply wouldn't be possible to continually hand weed our flower farm each week especially since we refuse to use herbicides. In our estimation, the plastic covering is the least of the two evils, and we intend on using our sheets of landscape fabric for years to come before throwing them away. So feel free to call me a hypocrite in the comments. There are likely many other areas in our garden that are not perfectly sustainable. And I say this because I don't want anyone to feel like I am judging them for their choices. The intent of this video is to share a few of the most prevalent and concerning issues with modern gardening practices, and to, more importantly, highlight some practical solutions that can lead us forward. So let's talk about some sustainable practices for our garden. The main roadblock when it comes to sustainability is that it's rarely caught before it's too late. To give an extreme example, animal extinction. Have you ever seen a passenger pigeon? Unlikely, considering that they were overhunted in North America to the point of extinction in 1914. There had been billions of these pigeons, but they were easy targets for hunters, and before we realized it, oops, we had killed too many, and they ended up dying off, never to return. The rate of hunting the passenger pigeon in this case was not a sustainable pace, but it was only recognized too late to stop their extinction. On a less easily visual level, chemical or synthetic fertilizers, NPK synthetic fertilizers are specifically what I'm talking about here. The way that nitrogen is derived to create these requires large amounts of natural gas, where atmospheric nitrogen is heated and pressurized to create ammonia. It's a really cool scientific innovation, but the energy requirements put it in the unsustainable category. And when it comes to the phosphorus and the potassium, we're mining these minerals from finite geological deposits that take millions of years to form. Now, NPK fertilizers are unsustainable in other ways too. They weaken soil biology, they can pollute waterways when used on mass scales, and cause other issues when used regularly. But it's hard to see these effects in the day-to-day, and it's especially hard to see when it's the broadly accepted norm. Now, while we're on fertility, let's take a look at some more sustainable options for our garden. My broad definition of fertility refers to the way that we get our plants the nutrients that they need. But if you're a regular of this channel, you probably know that in an ideal world, we, as the gardeners, aren't the ones directly feeding plants nutrients. Microorganisms in the soil and on the plants are the primary ones assisting in that process. Recall that when I mentioned the energy-intensive approach to deriving ammoniacal nitrogen from the atmosphere, interestingly, there are microbes, specifically bacteria called rhizobia, that do that same thing. We call it nitrogen fixation, but actinomycetes, also another type of bacteria, have also been found to assist in nitrogen fixation. And what do you know, their energy needs are pretty minimal. One of the best ways to encourage these microbes to capture and fix nitrogen in the soil is for you to grow a legume, such as a cover crop, like hairy vetch, clover, and peas. But actinomycetes, another type of bacteria, have also been found to assist in nitrogen fixation. These bacteria partner with the actinorhizal plants like alders and sweetgale to do this. So just by growing certain plants, you can start to bypass the need to rely on synthetic fertilizers. Another way that I like to grow fertility for our garden is by making homemade concoctions, liquid inputs from particularly nutrient-rich plant matter. Comfrey, yarrow, and borage are three of my favorites, largely because they are so easy to grow. These become mature plants quickly, they get established, and then provide lots of above ground biomass to harvest and use to make solutions like Jadam liquid fertilizer and fermented plant juice. You can also use them as nitrogen sources for your compost pile, or even just chop and drop them down and spread them across your garden as an organic mulch that is super rich in essential minerals. Now, if the idea of growing a plant largely for the value that it will bring to the rest of the garden feels like a stretch for you, I get it. It sort of feels like maybe you started out wanting to bake a loaf of sourdough bread, and now you're being told that you really need a Banneton and a Lam to make it work. But the thing is, a lot of these plants that I'm talking about are more like Swiss Army knives than single-use tools. They don't just produce a ton of above-ground biomass that can be used to build fertility, they also provide pollinators with food sources, and they can be used to fill out underutilized corners of your property that might have been used just to grow weeds instead. They can be turned into medicinal salves. A lot of them aren't bad to look at either. Point is, though, regardless of the inconvenience of growing a plant so that you can grow your other plants better, that fertility needs to come from somewhere. And if that means that you either buy a product whose source has an expiration date and you need to keep buying it over and over and over again, or you grow a plant that can provide you with a lot in exchange for very little beyond the space itself, the sustainable option actually becomes the more convenient choice in the long run. Let's take a look at sustainability when it comes to the way that we treat the soil. An unsustainable example of soil treatment, possibly one of the most obvious ones and easiest to pick on, is tillage. And this overlaps with our discussion on regenerative practices, so we'll save it for them. There are so many sustainable options for treating our soil. Mulching the soil, just keeping it covered at all, is a more sustainable approach long term than leaving it bare. Bare soil compacts very quickly and easily, whereas mulched soil helps to preserve soil structure just by being covered. But one of the most sustainable soil treatments that I can think of comes from our friends from the Amazon rainforest who added biochar, or activated charcoal, that had been loaded up with nutrients and microbes. This kind of fits into the fertilization plan as well, but to touch on why biochar feels like such a sustainable option is because it's kind of a one and done addition. It's actually not recommended that you add a whole bunch all at once. A little over time can be added to the soil, even just incorporated into compost that is used to top dress the soil each season. But the thing about it is that it doesn't degrade, or at least it won't degrade within your lifetime. Biochar, properly made, is what some people like to refer to as a permanent compost because it houses microbes and nutrients in vast quantities, and it stores them inside of its porous structure indefinitely, continually providing soil life with a home and not depleting. For the sake of keeping things moving, we'll take a look at system of sustainability. There will be no surprise to any of you long-time watchers, but let me know in the comments some other sustainable soil treatment techniques that you practice or are interested in learning about. When I think about systems that bring sustainability, I'm referring to a broad spectrum of topics here. But at the core, I mean systems that make garden upkeep easy to maintain for us, the gardeners. An unsustainable choice that many of us might feel like we have to make is to collect unused yard debris and toss it in the yard waste bin so that the city can handle it. But in my opinion, almost every single piece of yard waste material can actually be used to make soil in some way or another. And we talk about this a lot about the mechanisms to do this. We have a whole video looking at the process of building a closed loop garden that you can check out if you're interested in doing that. But one of the simplest and basicest options for yard waste, and specifically turning yard waste into soil, is to keep chickens. To put it as succinctly as possible, replace your yard waste bin with your chicken pen. From what I can tell, home gardeners who keep chickens criminally underutilize their chickens for processing materials. You can really stack up yard debris in here, and the chickens love it. They literally follow me along the fence line when they see me bringing a bucket, because of all of the weeds from our garden that go in there. And along with the weeds, there's bound to be bugs, as at least that seems to be their logic. Dried leaves, lawn clippings, sticks, wood chips, everything that you'd think about getting rid of, just give it to the chickens instead. People like to talk about doing the deep litter method for their chicken pen, and then they spread like an inch of straw on this ground and call it good. You can go a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet deep if you've got the space. And then I like to come in here every once in a while and just use a pitchfork to toss up the materials a bit. Wet them down if you live in a dry climate, and bugs and insects are going to find their way into this stuff and be extra food for the chickens. Then after a month or 2 or 3 or 6 or 12, pull out the bedding, hot compost it, and add more material. This is a sustainable system because it eliminates confusion for you. You don't have to ask, what do I do with this yard debris? It entertains the chickens, supplements their feed, makes you compost. And yes, you obviously need to invest in a coop and chicken feed and whatnot, but the output that you're getting from your chickens is so much higher than the input, in my opinion. And of course, I almost forgot to mention that you get eggs as a bonus. Now, we can't cover every single sustainable choice that you can make for your garden in this video. The main thing that I want you to take away is actually a change in mindset. These techniques and mechanisms are meant to be ideas that spur you onto adapting them for your context or even inventing new solutions. So hopefully things are coming together for you. Maybe you've already started to look at your yard differently. From here, I want to move into regenerative gardening. And again, in my mind, this is not a tier above sustainable gardening. It's adjacent and overlapping. Regenerative, remember, just refers to leaving things better than they were originally. And the reason that regenerative farming has taken off so much over the past 10 years is, at least in part and in my opinion, because there's been so much degeneration. Degenerative practices fertilizing techniques, soil treatment, and systems that have left us in a worse place than we were 10, 20, 100 years ago. For home gardeners, the soil that you inherited when you moved to your property was likely not ideal for growing in. And this leaves you with a simple but head-scratching question: can this soil be salvaged? Now, it's my personal belief that the future of agriculture lies with more farms growing on smaller plots of land and utilizing better practices. So instead of relying on huge million-acre farms that ship food all over the country, I think that we're going to be forced eventually to start buying locally again. And this is a good thing. I think we'll see more and more small-scale growers popping up who provide for their communities out of their backyards. But if that's going to happen, we need to have ways that we can improve the soil that we're working with. And so when it comes to regenerative practices, there are a few that I want to highlight, again, to give you ideas that'll get you started. As far as regenerative fertility, a major shift that needs to happen in our thinking is one from thinking plant nutrition is a strictly chemical endeavor to a chemical and biological joint endeavor. Microbiology has taken huge leaps in discovery made over the past few decades, but it takes a really long time for scientific findings to not just reach the public, but also to get presented in tangible and practical ways that people can understand and implement. When it comes to the garden, a lot of folks are just waking up to the idea of applying microbial solutions and solid form inoculants to their soil in conjunction with plant nutrients. And I consider microorganism cultivation for this purpose to be one of the most sustainable and certainly regenerative options that we have as home gardeners to fertilize our plants. Now, fertilizer, again, is a term that has been co-opted a bit, or at least restricted to meaning a substance that provides plant available nutrients. And so for that reason, I rarely use the term fertilizer to refer to microbial inputs that I make for our plants. But fertility really more accurately refers to the process of reproduction and the reproductive viability of plants and animals. And when we think about the word in those terms, chemistry is certainly a part of the equation, but biology is a more compelling lens to look through, in my opinion. Specifically, when we apply curated microbes to the soil or to the plants, we're providing them with many things all at once. We're helping their immune system, we're helping them fend off disease, we're helping them utilize and transport nutrients, and we're supplying plants with partners who will help convert previously unavailable plant nutrients into bioavailable plant nutrients. Now, applying synthetic fertilizers to our plants in the soil skips all of those things except for the last step of providing bioavailable nutrients. Someone actually recently commented on a video of ours saying all synthetic fertilizer does is remove the delay for what the soil microbiome would have taken weeks to months to do. And what they're referring to here is the process of breaking down organic matter into chemicals that the plant can use for food. Take grass clippings, for example. Fresh cut grass is full of nitrogen, but plants don't have mouths and guts to digest their material. Their mouths and guts are external to their body. It all happens in the soil that they're planted in. So that's where we would need to put the grass in our mouths, chew it up, swallow it, and let our gut microbes and acids digest the material for us to be able to uptake nutrients into our bloodstream. Soil microbes do that processing for the plants and then deliver the nutrients to the plant's root systems. So why not just give plant nutrients in their chemical form? Because microbes serve multiple functions. As I just mentioned, they aid in providing plants' immune systems. They connect plants in the soil to each other and send signals to other plants so that resources can be shared. They defend plants against pests and much more. And that's my simple explanation of why microbes are a crucial piece of the puzzle. As far as their regenerative effect, especially when it comes to perennial plants, but certainly when it comes to the soil microbiome itself, microbe-rich environments train plants and soil to grow in a specific way, a symbiotic way. Cultivating the fungi in a perennial system sets up your garden for long-lasting and eventually self-propagating fertility. Fungi doesn't magically create new nutrients. We still need to add organic matter to the soil surface to feed them a well-balanced diet. But there are many nutrients pre-existing within the soil that are simply out of reach to plants because they're locked up, bonded onto other compounds. And fungi and bacteria take the time to break apart those compounds and make previously inaccessible minerals available to plants to harvest. This discussion is pretty dense, so thank you for hanging out while we walk through this. For my application point here, the reason that I wanted to take the time to explain this a little bit more thoroughly is because one of the most effective and worthwhile mechanisms for regenerative fertility is also one of the more challenging, and that is cultivating indigenous microbes. This is another Korean natural farming input that we make for our garden, and it takes shape through 4 essential phases. The collection phase, IMO 1, where a container of cooked grains is left in an undisturbed forest to collect indigenous microbes. The preservation stage, IMO 2, where that collection is preserved by mixing with sugar to dehydrate the microbes. IMO 3, where the microbe collection is diversified and propagated out onto a new substrate. And then IMO 4, where the indigenous microbes are integrated with your local garden or field soil. This is then applied to the soil, similar to how a compost would be used to top dress the soil, but far less is used because of its potency. We won't go through the entire process of cultivating IMO at this moment. Again, check out the resources that I've already mentioned if that sounds like something that you would be interested in. We have plenty of videos already on this topic as well. Moving into regenerative soil treatment techniques, we're going to simplify quite a bit and return to tillage and soil disturbance in general. Now, specifically, I'm talking about repeated tillage here. A one-time till to break up the soil that's super compacted, I don't see anything wrong with that inherently, especially if you have a compaction layer that you'd rather not fight for the rest of time. But tilling every year doesn't lead to regeneration. It actually, at best, is like a reset button for the soil because it's destroying soil structure and harming soil biology. But at worst, it's actually a degenerative practice that multiple studies have found to have a worse effect on soil than even harsh herbicide treatment when used repeatedly. This can be hard to visualize, especially since traveling into the soil and watching soil structure being built isn't quite possible for most of us. But to pick up on our sourdough thread from earlier, let's look at a sort of similar example that might be able to help us out. When you feed a sourdough starter, you are adding flour and water to other flour and water that also contains microbes, specifically wild yeast, lactic acid and acetic acid bacteria. This culture, when introduced to more food, will begin to colonize that food source. And the way that we know that colonization is occurring is because of the tangy smell that starts developing, but even more noticeably, the expanding volume. As the yeasts and bacteria consume the sugar in the flour, they excrete carbon dioxide that gets trapped in the mixture. And that is a decent idea of what it looks like when we allow microbes to inhabit the soil undisturbed. Because the moment that you mix up the sourdough culture, it deflates and compresses, and all of that CO2 is lost. By mixing up the soil over and over again, we're breaking up that naturally occurring structure that's getting built when microbes are left alone to do their thing. Same goes for stepping on or compressing the soil. The more the soil is disturbed, the more that it will gradually compact, and the less the soil is disturbed, the more the natural structure gets built and retained. The difference between sourdough culture and soil is that sourdough will poof up and fully ferment within a matter of hours, and it will naturally lose its structure as it collapses in on itself. Whereas the soil takes years to build its structure, but it doesn't recompact so long as it's left covered or planted in. Now, this topic of disturbance is less relevant for the soil in the top few inches where you're going to be planting your seeds or transplanting your plant starts. It's really those mid to lower layers of the soil that need to be taken care of to make sure that they don't get compressed. And so simply by keeping the soil covered or planted in, and then not stepped on or broken apart, is an example of regenerative soil treatment. And this is why no-till farming is often categorized as a regenerative farming option. As far as regenerative systems that we might look at, there are many that we could explore. We've already touched on livestock a little bit with our chicken pen discussion, but I see animal integration in general as a very natural regenerative component. Plants in nature coexist with animals, and both are codependent on each other. Another huge topic of regenerative systems that we could look at would be planting schemes. And I think that people can get a little bit in their heads about this because it's in some ways a lot simpler than many people would lead you to believe. But just taking a page out of the permaculture playbook, investing in basic plant guilds out and about throughout your garden can have a regenerative effect. In that when certain plants are interplanted with one another, performing multiple functions, not only are they more self-sustaining, but the partnerships that get created in the soil have a regenerative effect. And a really interesting way to see this happening all on its own, driven by nature, is just by looking at a lawn that's been left to grow or overgrow on its own. In the US, there's a trend called No Mow May, where homeowners with lawns are encouraged to just let their grass grow uncut for the entire month of May. And what many have seen and reported is that wildflowers and other native plants spring out of the ground amidst the grass, creating a sort of natural meadow effect. What this can show us, if we pay attention, is that nature doesn't really do a monoculture very well. Left on their own, most grass lawns would become multi-species plant guilds over enough time. Now with plant guilds, we have more of an opportunity to create this sort of environment intentionally. In permaculture, we have various levels that we can address, and within these levels, certain plants can be used to serve certain functions. We've got the ground cover, or the herbaceous layer, the root layer, the shrubs, the climbers, the understory, and the canopy, not to mention fungi, wetlands, and probably more. But even just planting various plants that serve different functions together will become co-beneficial systems that will require little maintenance and gradually improve each other over time. We've already talked through the concept of sustainably growing our fertility on site, but this takes it a step further where we can co-plant a dynamic accumulator with a long taproot alongside a nitrogen fixer, alongside a pollinator attracting plants, and so on and so forth. And I'll admit, because we're restarting this year mostly from scratch, we are still in the process of getting our guilds set up and even strategized. I hope to be able to show you many more examples of paths that you could take, or at the very least, ideas that you could take and apply to your garden in your region in the future. Guilds are not quite a viable integration within our cut flower row bed system right now, since we're there in higher rotation. As we develop perennial systems, we'll be investing in creating more regenerative guilds. As we start to wrap things up, you might be asking, what am I supposed to do exactly? Use this video as a jumping off point and as a return point or a point of reference. You could choose a few of these techniques to try out, see what you learn, make some observations, and then come back and think through next steps to bring more sustainability and regenerative effects to your growing space. Now, if you'd appreciate a little bit more help that is specifically geared toward you and your exact situation, you can apply for my Natural Garden Reboot program, where we cover a lot of this and can help you get set up or reestablished fairly quickly. You can hit the link in the description or scan the code on the screen if you'd like to connect with me. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for hanging out. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the interplay between Korean natural farming and permaculture, two systems that I referenced in and throughout this video, you will want to check out this video next. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.